Mhm.
Are you humming the Jeopardy song?
I've been watching it every day with my son. Well, almost every day. Reruns, of course. Well,
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Reruns, yeah.
Did you see
better
the
than
Tournament of Champions a couple of
being
weeks ago?
funny.
Those guys were amazing.
I didn't see that one, but we've been just going back and watching this and that with Jeopardy. It's pretty cool.
How old's your son, Eddie?
He is 17. He just graduated, not graduated. He just became a senior, finished
Oh, wow.
11th grade.
How did that happen? Yeah. All right, I'm gonna stop my share so I can get ready to record. I don't think it'll let me do both at once. There we go. Oh, now we're on gallery view.
I just came from work. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I should have cut it off about right here.
Oh, it's great to see everyone. And I see that we are now streaming live on Facebook. So that's outstanding. And it looks like, Haley, correct me if I'm wrong. Now I have us on gallery view, but everybody else has us on speaker view.
Now it's on, it should be on speaker view. Yep.
Okay. So I think I want to leave gallery view.
Okay. There's gallery view then.
How did I, no, I want to leave the gallery view, but I think when I stopped sharing my screen, I messed
Oh, I
that
just
up.
changed it. So that's gallery view, that's speaker view.
On mine, it's just speaker view. I mean, it's gallery view. I guess it's speaker view, but we're across the top. Okay. All right. Well, I think it's about 7:05. Are most people people are in? Haley, should we give it another minute or are we good to
You
go?
have 17 participants, so it's up to you.
What say you, friends? I never want to punish the people who are on time.
My clock says we have about another minute.
Okay, we're going to go by you. You're the Zoom master.
You can't be late if you don't start on time.
There you go. I'm having memories of the seminary synagogue where Rabbi Greenberg of blessed memory would bang on the stender and weddings start late, but funerals usually start on time.
Yeah, I try to start on time.
Yes. So it seems that we should be starting on time.
Not for this. It's okay.
No. Well, we always want to allow for the technical difficulties of people getting in. All right, I'm watching for Haley to send me perhaps a private message, but give it one more minute. If we start at 7:07, that seems like a very lucky and long time to start. So while we're waiting, I'm just, let me just say to everyone that we're going to be sharing some links into the chat, and I encourage everybody to share questions into the chat as we go along. Our Zoom master extraordinaire, Haley, will be kind of collecting the questions and consolidating them and putting them to the top, and we'll try to pause as we go along and ask for questions. Although we have a full plate of material that we're looking forward to sharing. And I'll encourage everybody to stay muted and during the presentation part, and please use the chat. I believe that you can chat to individuals, and I'm just, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm not going to be looking at the chat because I find it really distracting. But Haley will let us know if there are things coming into the chat for each of us. So I think we're ready to go. We're ready to start? Excellent.
Ready?
Okay, so let me just, I've been told that I should pause for a moment. I'm gonna hit record. So I'm gonna be recording this onto my computer so that we can learn from our first experience, our first conversation, and improve on the next ones. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. I would like to very quickly just introduce myself and then introduce my friends who are here for this conversation about Jewish and green burial for the die-curious Jews. So I'm Rabbi Pamela Gottfried. I serve, at Congregation Beit Haverim, and also as the rabbi of Your Jewish Bridge, which is a project of CBH that is partly funded by a Propel and Innovation grant from the Federation of Greater Atlanta. And the initiative was launched to serve the needs of unaffiliated Jews in Metro Atlanta. So first, before we begin, I want to thank CBH and Federation for co-hosting this event, together with Dressler's Jewish Funeral Care and TG Beyond. And now I would like to invite my two friends from those organizations who join me in this conversation to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about them and the organizations that they are here from. So Eddie, why don't we start with you?
All right. Thank you, Pamela. So Dressler's Jewish Funeral Care, we started in 1997. I'm born and raised in Atlanta, and I went to school in Philadelphia. I went to work for a relative of my dad who was in the funeral business in New York. And I came back to Atlanta after graduating college and worked for a funeral home for 4 years, and then left, and that was 1997. We started our company. And so a few years later, I partnered with North Atlanta Memorial Park, and so we started a Jewish section there actually this year. And so, we handle local burials, we send people to other cities, we handle non-traditional, and we handle funerals for veterans of armed forces, including burial in VA cemeteries. We send to Israel a few times a year for burial as well. And we prepare headstones at the various cemeteries as part of it, and we do some pre-planning. And that's sort of the gist of it.
Great, thanks. I'm going to pass to Barry Koch. I don't know if people know Barry or the organization TG and Beyond, so I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about that.
Hey guys, thanks Rabbi and thanks Eddie. My name is Barry Koch. Until about 3 years ago, I was working in media for 30 years and ran the Cartoon Network in Latin America. So what the heck am I doing on this call? I think I dialed the wrong Zoom address. I had a son named Harper who was born in 1996, my wife and I did, and he passed away in 1997. And at that time, I came into contact with hospice for the first time. And I've been doing some hospice volunteer work, some board work, some other things for hospice for the last 20 or 23 years. And as my career at Cartoon Network was phasing out, I always had a notion and was attracted to this end of life space. About a year and a half ago, a partner and I, Jason Zamer, who I think is on the call tonight, started an initiative called TG Beyond. And the thinking behind TG Beyond, and I think many of us who have been through an end-of-life experience can relate to this. If you have a relative who has an illness and you're going through the medical process and perhaps the assisted living process, skilled nursing process, dealing with maybe some estate planning or will planning, perhaps they die, and then you go through a funeral service, maybe with Eddie Dressler or with somebody else. And then you've got houses to clean up, and you've got grief and bereavement, and you've got legal and administrative things to do, or maybe you want a different form of memorial. Every one of those is a very segmented, distinct business. And as individuals and people going through this, we're sort of on our own to negotiate the process, however easy or however difficult that is. The goal behind TG Beyond is to work with trusted providers who have what we call a death positive orientation to create a continuum of care to help us go through that process, because dying is actually very hard on the living. And we want to provide access, inspiration, and permission for lots of different services that can help us going through the process. And one of those things that we've hit on that we're very interested in and that we're very actively engaged in is the notion of green funeral or green burial, which we'll be speaking about tonight, and how that intersects and overlaps very nicely with traditional Jewish burial.
Could you just say one word defining the definition of green burial? And I think Haley is going to put into the chat the Green Burial Council page.
Yeah, there's an organization out there called the Green Burial Council, which is very focused on education and advocacy. The way they define green burial is a way of caring for the dead with minimal environmental impact that aids in the conservation of natural resources, reduction of carbon emissions, protection of worker health, and the restoration and or preservation of habitat. That's actually a little bit clinical for me. You know, green is environmentally friendly, it is gentle, it is simple, it saves resources, it connects with nature. And I'll talk more about this throughout the night, but one thing that I have found personally is green burial services can be remarkably intimate. You're a little bit more engaged in the process. There's a little bit more family participation. And I have found them to be very, very gentle and intimate.
Thank you. I pushed you to say that now because I also wanted to say how we met was back in a few months ago before quarantine. Barry and I met at a green burial service out at Honey Creek Woodlands, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. I had been approached by a friend of his who was interested in green burial for his dad. And this was through Your Jewish Bridge. And we met and we rode kind of out to the burial site together and participated in the service together. And from there, the conversation kind of continued, and that's how we arrive at this evening. And of course, I should also have mentioned that Eddie Dressler was one of the first people that I met when I came to Atlanta in 1999. That was at the AA synagogue, and Dressler's hadn't started yet. So this really was meant to be, we want to make this personal and sort of talk. We're really having a conversation among friends, and we have invited you to listen in and ask us some questions and interrupt us with questions. And try to make both the intersection, I guess, of Jewish and green more relatable and just help people have a better awareness of how they are in many ways very compatible. So I'm going to back up for a second and start with before the moment of death. So as Barry kind of led us there, that there's a continuum of death. We usually say death and dying in Jewish language, but it should really be dying and death. And while we don't have the time tonight to talk about visiting the sick, which is really what comes before, I wanted to begin with the idea that knowing what our loved ones' wishes are and making our own wishes known with regard to death, a funeral and burial really begins before the moment of death. And I think that even people who are not necessarily religious, so I think we said the assimilated and the unaffiliated and the die-curious might have strong feelings about certain religious customs being observed when they die. And unless you have that conversation beforehand or make your wishes known, then there's no way to know for the next of kin. There's no way for the people to know what their loved ones wanted. And so the other thing that I think is interesting is a lot of people don't know about the Jewish tradition that involves or includes a deathbed confession prayer. So I think when we talk about deathbed confession, everyone thinks that that's Catholic. But in fact, in Judaism, there's something called vidui, which is a confessional prayer that is said when death is imminent. And so a person who is dying is encouraged to recite this prayer. The prayer is asking for forgiveness from God, and it ends with the Shema. I think maybe people are familiar with the idea that when you die, you're supposed to have the Shema Yisrael on your lips. And so the prayer kind of goes through and asking, it's an opportunity for the dying person to let go of regrets and die in a state of tshuva, which is also known as repentance, or return to God, that the soul returns to God at the moment of death. So if a dying person is incapacitated or unable to speak or unable to say the vidui, it can be recited on their behalf by a rabbi or a loved one or anyone who is present. And the last thing I wanted to say is that Jewish tradition teaches us to be present with the dying. No one is supposed to feel abandoned at the moment of death. And that was a very, I remember, years ago that before hospice care became more well-known. Of course, originally, people died at home, surrounded by their loved ones. And at that moment of death, it was someone who loved them that closed their eyes and closed their mouth and covered their face. And the original tradition of grieving was to rend one's garment and recite the words at that moment, Baruch Dayan Emet, blessed is the true judge, which is acknowledging that this is not in our hands, that the moment of death is not up to us, it's up to God. Now, most people wait, I'm sure Eddie will talk about this later, wait to perform this ritual right before the funeral or even at the burial. And usually we do with a little ribbon, a black ribbon. So I just, recently, just today, a few hours ago, and Sunday night participated in a vidui remotely and a funeral today where, which was also remote, where I reflected on this idea of that participating in this confessional prayer. That was the first time that I had done that with someone who was not able to, who was not necessarily awake or aware when we were saying this prayer together. And I've been giving it a lot of thought about, I was on speakerphone, the caretaker was holding the phone for the person. And I've thought a lot about whether, how it was challenging to feel that there was a presence there, but somehow in reciting that prayer, I really believe that, that she heard it. So, so that was, as a rabbi, I've recently had that experience and I've been thinking a lot about it. And I wanted to pass to Barry because I know that you wanted to say a few words about this part as well.
Yeah, no, for those of you on the phone, my mother passed away very unexpectedly on Sunday. She had a very bad accident on Saturday and died on Sunday. We're not a particularly religious family, but as the rabbi was just describing, offering or giving the vidui remotely, my mother, my brother and sister and I were the recipients, or on the receiving end of that. And I have to say, there's a lot of talk during these COVID times about people being separated from loved ones, not being able to gather, not being able to be present. We were fortunate enough to be able to be present when my mom passed. And with a family dispersed all over the country, I have to say that the virtuality of the whole experience was surprisingly meaningful and impactful in a way that I would not have imagined had I not gone through it.
We're really glad you could be here tonight.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I'm going to pass just really quickly through the next sort of stage in the process, which is called aninut and shmirah, which is basically from the moment of death, between the moment of death and when the body is buried. So between death and burial. And from that very moment of death until the body is laid to rest in the ground, the Jewish custom is not to leave the deceased unattended. So shmirah means guarding, right, or attending to the body. And we actually call a person who sits with the deceased, with the body, a shomer or a guardian. And usually that person, it's traditional to recite psalms and not leave the body unattended. And I wanted to pass to Eddie. And can you say a little bit about how a Jewish funeral home helps make those arrangements for
Sure.
shmirah?
Sure. So in most communities, there are individuals who the funeral home calls on to come and sit as a shomer, and typically the families are paying them. In some small communities, it may be provided by the Jewish community, but in most cases, these are people who we have a list and we call on them and they come and they go in shifts, either 6 or 8 or 12 hours. Day and night, and of course we're usually burying within 1 or 2, sometimes 3 days. family members are welcome to come and sit or send friends. We do allow that, certainly, but most rely on us to make that arrangement.
And how is it going now, like during this time of sheltering in place and COVID-19?
Right. So
What
we
does that
still,
look like?
yeah. So we still allow, and of course, you know, in our building, we right away began the process of keeping everything disinfected and having a regular plan for that. And you know, our staff is required to wear masks when they're around or sitting with other people. And the Shomrim similarly are to, you know, we sort of set some guidelines for them. They're not allowed to ride in the hearse to the cemetery. They have to drive separately. But other than that, they sort of have their own space at the funeral home. And so they have rules about keeping things clean and disinfected, and we provide that for them. And you know, just naturally staying apart from our staff and anybody else they come in contact with. So it still works, but they just have to be careful.
Mhm.
And certainly anybody who wanted to opt out who was sitting before, which a few have, at least during this time.
Mhm. And so I think it's hard to talk about Shmirah without also wanting to go right away to the idea of the Chevra Kadisha, which I'm going to actually ask you to talk a little bit about, but so we're going to continue if Haley will put in the chat the ideas of, or the concept of Tahara, which is the preparation of the body for burial, which is usually done, or often can be done by a Chevra Kadisha, which is called a holy society, that washes the body and wraps it in shrouds and places the body in a simple wooden casket, which is usually closed. And I thought before we pass to Barry to talk about the connections with green, I just wondered, Eddie, if you could say a few words about sort of that process, how it's being handled now during COVID, what's going on in these days.
Okay, so in general, in Atlanta, many of the synagogues have their own Chevra Kadisha, women's group and men's group. And so if you're connected to a traditional synagogue, it's required for burial in their burial grounds, or if the rabbi's officiating the funeral. And then there are some synagogues that have Chevra Kadisha where it's not required, but it's an option. And then of course, anybody who's choosing a burial locally or out of town, and if they're not connected to a synagogue that has a Chevra Kadisha, but still want that, if that's important to them, then we arrange for one of the Chevra Kadisha groups to perform the Tahara. So with COVID, what's happened is, you know, we had a meeting with all the group leaders and also discussions with rabbis in the community about what to do. And we, like Dresslers, we came up with our own guidelines in conjunction with the National Chevra Kadisha group that prepared guidelines, and we modified that, and we basically made strong recommendations. We didn't have any particular requirements, but most of the Chevra Kadisha chose to follow what we recommended, which was to allow, because we have to interact with the deceased and handle the body of the deceased, we were going to do that anyway. And so to limit exposure, mostly with each other, less with the possibility of contracting something from the deceased, and more just interacting with us and themselves, to limit them coming to the funeral home. So Dresslers would minimize the handling as well as swaddle the deceased in the shroud, right? And then they could choose to send a person or persons to recite the appropriate prayers that are part of the Tahara, or they could choose to do it over the phone or via Zoom, whichever they thought was best. And of course, they could also choose to send a group to perform the entire Tahara. So the Chevra Kadisha that did choose to do that, we requested that they only send 2, maybe 3 individuals at most to handle the deceased. And that was our recommendation. And most really, they're following that for the most part. And we right away implemented, I was able to purchase these face shields. So, and again, mostly their interaction with each other, so they're not breathing on each other in addition to the mask, they have the face shield, right? So that was good. And luckily, from the beginning, we already had in our possession lots of personal protective items, you know, gloves, gowns, and such. So I went ahead and I purchased these raincoats as a backup that we could disinfect if we needed, if we ran out of gowns. But everything has worked out so far. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks. I wanted to note also, I think there are some members of CBH's Chevra Kadisha that are on the call. I know that we have a group of women, I think, that are volunteers and are able to take care and prepare the body of women. I don't know if we have a men's group up and running yet, and I have no idea if during COVID that we've been doing that. But if you want to put in the chat, identify yourselves. If you have anything that you want to add, please go ahead and put it in the chat. I'm also going to pause for a quick second and remind everybody who is joining us on Facebook Live, if you did not register for the event, please put your email into the chat. And so that we're going to reach out afterwards, and we'll share if you were on the call early, we have an infographic that we'll share that's going to show the connections between Jewish and green burial, and some resources that we're going to share out probably tomorrow, I hope, before Shavuot. So please give us your emails if we don't have them, if you didn't register. And send your questions in the chat. It's been very quiet, so but we're going to keep pressing on, and I'll keep pausing if there are any questions after this next section where we talk about preparing the body in a green way. I'll pause, and if there are questions, we can kind of take them as we go, or we can save them for the end. Okay, so the preparing of the body, the washing the body, the wrapping it in shrouds, and the no embalming of the body. So the certain ways that the body is prepared and handled in green burial, which Barry is going to talk about, you'll see that there's a real connection to Jewish tradition.
Thanks. Yeah, and I want to be, this is the disclaimer at the upfront, just in case any of my Orthodox friends are on the call. We're not saying that Jewish burial is green burial or that green burial is Jewish burial, but there are definitely places where, from a sensibility and an actual practice point of view, they do overlap and they are compatible, so that one who is having a Jewish burial could in fact be green. And starting with the preparation of the body. One of the tenets of green burial is no use of traditional formaldehyde-based embalming fluids. So the practice is generally to either not embalm, and there are some people who opt to do home funerals and other types of cooling techniques, which we're not going to talk about here. But so either no embalming, or there are green embalming fluids, which I personally have no experience with. Eddie, I don't know if you do, but I've been reading, and these are basically essential oil type products. I honestly don't know that they do the preservation work that traditional embalming fluid does, but they are out there. The other place at this stage of the funerary process where there might be some overlap is the notion of shrouding the body or using simple caskets. In green burial, the notion is that you will use simple biodegradable products, woods that break down, no metal fasteners, no toxic glues, or in fact shrouding the body itself. Both of those are consistent with Jewish burial processes. And one thing about shrouding, and we had the Rabbi Eddie and I had a conversation about this the other day. I was at a funeral, a green burial, a couple of months ago that Rabbi Gottfried officiated, where for the first time I was in the presence of a shrouded body. And well, for some, and I think Eddie, you shared this, it might be a bit of a shock. Seeing the outline, and I did not know the man being buried, I was friendly with the son, but seeing the outline of a body of a man in a shroud humanized and personalized the experience in a pretty remarkable way. I mean, Eddie, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that notion of showing up graveside to see a shrouded body.
Well, like you just said, I think it's not what people are used to seeing at a funeral. So certainly not opposed to it, but I think it requires some information prior to the service, where there's an announcement that what the crowd may see while they're there, so that they're not, there isn't any shock factor.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. I kind of want to jump in and talk about the intimacy of it. But I guess we're not there yet, so I'm going to hold off. But Barry, can you just say a little bit more now about the why green, sort of like the broader, so I don't know if people, it's hard to know who's on the call, how many of you signed up because you're interested in Jewish, and how many of you are interested in burial, in green burial, but some of the reasons that people choose green. And I think that's going to lead us to a couple of questions that are in the chat. So there's some questions about cremation, and there are questions about organ donation and how that all plays into it. And I'll let Barry go first. And Eddie, maybe you can jump in about organ donation. Or I will.
Sure.
Go ahead,
So if the
Barry.
notion is why green, if the notion is why green, I would start off by saying, and I think we've used this word a couple of times, the notion of continuum, right? So there can be pure green, there can be a little bit green, there can be greenish. And I think actually that parallels to contemporary Judaism as well, where you can be really, really orthodox and observant, or you can sort of pick and choose and fit together, which is kind of what I've done for most of my life. But at any rate, the reasons that are typically given for being green are environmentally friendly. Lesser carbon footprint. You're not putting lots of hardwoods, chemicals, concrete, and metal into the ground. So there's the energy associated with producing that and the waste associated with putting all that into the ground. So the notion of environmentally friendly. I think the reason it appeals to many people is a notion of getting back to nature, being buried in a more prosaic setting. And I have to say, I can't tell you how many people I know who, when I talk about this, say, I want to be a tree. A lot of people want to be a tree these days. So for those people who want to be trees, green is an option. In some settings, in some situations, it can be less costly. Often the mission of green cemeteries is maybe a little less commercially oriented. Hold your ears, Eddie. But in some cases, you're not paying for a casket that might be as expensive. In a state like Georgia, you're probably not burying with a cement or metal vault over the top, and you might not be embalming. So again, depending on the situation, depending on the setting, cost is sometimes given as a reason. What I have found for me personally is, and the rabbi's going to talk about this more, I think, the intimacy, the closeness, the connection, the ability to participate in the actual burial of somebody in a way that is different than other funerals that I have been to. So again, environmental, nature, potential cost savings, and again, for me, intimacy and connection, I think is a powerful reason to think green.
Yeah. Okay, before we talk about organ donation, the question came in from Miriam, which I knew it would, so we might as well go for it now. Eddie, are burials permitted in the North Atlanta Memorial, where CBH now has a section, so in the new cemetery, without a vault or grave liner and no casket?
Right, so
they
require, right. So it's kosher, but they require a vault and they require a minimum casket, the simplest form. So if, I've been working on with the owner pushing to do something green. We've discussed it a few different times over the last few years. The section started this year, but I partnered with the cemetery more than 7 years ago. It just took a while to get to this point. So, we've had conversations back and forth about it. And of course, again, when Barry brought this up in conversations, when we started meeting back and forth and discussing what he was doing, I would go back to Kelly Lincoln's cemetery and say, listen, we should try something and do something. And so I just need to continue the conversation with him.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
Rabbi, jumping in there for a sec. There are three different types of designations of green cemetery through the Green Burial Council. One is like the cemetery we're talking to is referred to as a hybrid, which is basically a traditional lawn cemetery with a section that might operate under green provisions, natural plants, less pesticides, different kinds of maintenance, etc. Then there is a natural burial ground, which is akin to like actually being out in the woods, like Honey Creek Woodlands.
Mhm.
And then there's a conservation cemetery, which has some ties to conservation agencies and easements, which is preserved as a natural woodland. So again, you can be in a traditional cemetery with a green section, or you can really be out in the woods and out in nature.
Mhm. And great. The question came in, is the vault a state law or requirement? And I'm guessing no. I'm going to let Eddie answer it, but since I participated in one where, it was in the woods, right? So no vault. And one of the questions that came up before I had participated in that green burial, and we sort of jumped ahead, is that it's not as deep. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but that was my immediate question, I guess, to Eddie was, does it have to be, let's talk about 6 feet under. It was about 3.5 feet down. And the explanation that was given was that if you go very deep, if the grave is dug very deep, that it's almost, especially in the Georgia clay, the soil is not aerated as much, and it's so that prevents the decomposition of the body. So I guess it's not a state law either, but I guess in North Atlanta, would they bury in more shallow graves?
I think for this purpose, it would make the most sense. It has to be deep enough so nothing's digging up what's there, right? The people were being buried, but shallow enough where it makes the most sense for the green part of it, and also just and I didn't even ask Barry if did they dig by hand at
Honey Creek
so
is they don't have a lot of equipment out there. Yeah.
Right. So also when you're digging by hand, if you have to dig deeper, it's probably a lot more work to do that. So it would sort of make sense to keep it at 3.5 to 4 feet.
Mm-hmm. And the digging by hand, of course, the minimizing the use of a lot of equipment is also an eco or green sensibility. So the question that came in about whether it was sort of state law at North Atlanta. So I think my understanding is that North Atlanta Memorial Park is willing or interested or has had conversations with you about opening a green section. And in that green section, they would not use a vault or not go as deep, but there needs to be more conversation because from a business point of view, right, there needs to be demand. I guess we haven't shown that there's demand yet for them to supply this special section. But what you had said in our previous conversation, Eddie, is that there is space where that could happen. Is that right?
Yes, there's space where that could happen. Yes.
So who knows what the future will bring? Maybe this call will generate even greater interest in green burial. So I want to back us up for a minute. I'm mindful of the time. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the funeral and the burial themselves. And Haley will put into the chat the words in Hebrew for that are livaya and kvura, funeral and burial, which has already been mentioned, that is performed as soon after the death as possible, within 1 to 2 days. In Jewish custom, it is because the idea of leaving the body unburied is considered both disrespectful to the deceased and also stressful to the mourners. So the mourners, until the body is buried, the mourners can't begin the period of bereavement. So until the casket is lowered and covered with dirt, or the body is buried, you can't start saying mourner's Kaddish. You can't sit Shiva. You're in this sort of limbo state if you're a mourner. And so I'm sure that the idea of burying quickly started in the ancient Near East for practical reasons, and there are also green reasons for doing this. But people don't necessarily think about that. Nowadays, we do delay funerals, and we have refrigeration now, and so there can be a delay in order for people to be able to come in from out of town. It also, if Eddie would mention after this about how they seem to be happening faster now because they're virtual. So there isn't so much delaying and waiting for people to travel to the funeral. Many funerals here in Georgia are graveside services. So the funeral and burial are together. For the funeral part, psalms are recited and a eulogy is offered to honor the memory of the deceased. Everything is supposed to be about the concept of kavod hamet, dignity for the deceased. There's a memorial prayer that asks that the soul of the deceased be bound up in eternal life. The grave is the body, in the case of green burial, without the casket, or the casket is lowered. And then there's a well-known custom, I think, of placing or shoveling dirt into the grave until at least the coffin is covered. By that custom is participated in by everyone who is present. First the mourners, and then the other people who are present at the burial. Where burial in shrouds without a coffin is not customary here, actually in Israel it's very customary, or on a bier, on a platform. And when we were talking before about sort of the more intimate or gentleness of the burial, particularly placing the dirt on the grave, at the green burial that we attended, because if you would shovel dirt onto the body, that would not be gentle, and it would be not treating the body with dignity. You're much closer, and so we had little trowels, so people can use a handful of dirt, and you're very close, and it's just a gentle kind of placing of dirt. And for me personally, I experienced this real sense of fulfilling the verse in Genesis, you came from dust, and from dust you will return. So this sense of really being surrounded in the earth, and it is that burial was at Honey Creek Woodlands, and it was really just kind of in the forest area. So you're not becoming a tree, but there are trees, and families are encouraged to plant trees in that green space. So the one question that comes up that's sort of a sticky point between green and Jewish is the idea that traditional Jewish burial is done in consecrated ground, right? So the place in which you are buried is sacred because it is a Jewish section of a cemetery, or it is a Jewish cemetery. And so that is something that if you wanted a green burial in one of these other cemeteries that do provide green or hybrid burials, that you could not probably fulfill. And I don't know how much, I guess it's a continuum, as we said, right? How much that matters. And this was the first time that I'd experienced it, and I was really persuaded. I thought, maybe I would want to do that. I don't know if I would want to be buried in a pod, with a tree sapling and actually become a tree, but the idea of being just not in a box and sort of in a more natural way was very appealing. I don't know how my kids would feel about that. We haven't gotten there yet, but I do think that when we discuss this among ourselves, it might be very jarring for people that had never seen a shrouded body before. But for me, it was the opposite. It was actually, it made it very real in a sense. So that's kind of all that I have to say, but I don't know who wants to go next and talk about, kind of wrap us up. Oh, Lauren just asked a question though. All right, we're gonna have to back up to cremation. That's where we're gonna go for the Q&A. But Lauren asked, if a body is buried merely in a shroud, is there a concern that the body will relocate in a heavy thunderstorm? What a great question.
I'm gonna take that and guess and say no. I think 3.5 feet deep with hundreds of pounds of dirt will probably prevent relocation. There's also additional for the first X number of months, a mound on top if you see these natural graves. So there's a pretty significant weight and amount of dirt on somebody. So I wouldn't think so. Eddie, I'm going to guess you agree with that.
Yeah, I would agree with that, certainly. I mean, it's gonna be ever so slight to none. That's all I have to say about it.
I'm laughing, but I'm smiling and I'm laughing because, of course, in the ancient times, the whole point was bury in a shallow grave, remove the bone as soon as the body has decomposed, take the bones out, and then put them in an ossuary, right, in a cave, and they would reuse the space. It was really green back then. And even the bones of multiple, like family members, right? So the multiple bodies of the bones would be kept in the family ossuary. If you've traveled to Israel and gone, caving up into those caves in the northern part of Israel, that was the original Jewish way of doing it. It's just, we wander from place to place and we adopt different cultural norms. So,
Rabbi, to that point, Jason and I attended a session at a convention recently, and we're marveling at some of the different customs around the world, Brazil, Japan, other places where people do bury or mausoleum space or columbarium space for a period of time, and then move out of there and somebody occupies that space, which seems to be not a custom at all, here in the U.S.
Yeah. All right, we're lighting up here in the questions. So people are, Lauren Levin also put in there, if you all saw in the chat, that they still remove the bones and replace family members in the same grave in Cuba. So I think sometimes necessity is what leads the custom, right? The practical custom, the need for space. Okay, people are gonna leave unhappy if we don't go back to organ donation and also cremation. So I'm holding those two things. So about organ donation, I think if I understood the question correctly, the question is about how does that fit in with the preparation of the body or delaying the funeral? That was kind of what we were talking about then. So I hope that that's sort of where the question was going. Organ donation is, we don't have time to talk about sort of the Jewish ethics, biomedical ethics. Organ donation is permitted in Jewish law. Many people, even some of my most Orthodox friends are organ donors. And obviously the body cannot be, so the removing of the organs, right, for them to be donated all has to happen before life support is taken off, right? So, or very soon after that. And then I think that the preparation of the body, and Eddie, you'll jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, that's where, at least in Georgia, that's where a funeral home has to step in, right? And to handle the body from the hospital to where the body is going to be prepared for burial. Is that correct?
Right. So with organ donation, where somebody's on life support, the harvesting is occurring in a hospital, and they move it along pretty quickly, and especially knowing if they're Jewish and wanted to move forward for burial quickly. So it doesn't. The organ donation may delay 1 or 2 days, possibly, and but it won't inhibit a tahara, that kind of preparation. And then there's, as many people might know, there's also tissue donation is when somebody donates after death, like skin and eye cornea, and there are a couple of other that can be donated. And so when somebody chooses to donate in those cases, they have to, of course, qualify. And then typically there's an entity called LifeLink that oversees that. And they have their own facility in Norcross. There aren't that many cases that we handle every year that have that kind of donation, but it does come up from time to time. There's a Georgia Eye Bank, and they'll come to the funeral home to do that kind of removal. And of course, everything has to be approved by the immediate family before, and hospitals are required to ask about organ donation. It's in Georgia law, before they release somebody who has passed away to a funeral home.
So that's great. So we got sort of the practical side, or the how it happens. And then about cremation, I'm going to pass back to Eddie, and then I also want Barry to talk a little bit about cremation and green. All I'll say about cremation is that it is, it was completely, I feel like I should use the German word verboten in Jewish tradition for a very long time. And there are still some people that just have a very visceral reaction to cremation following, obviously, the Shoah, the Holocaust. It's simply not done, you know, as my father would say, but it is done more and more. And so, Eddie, if you can talk a little bit about how Dressler's serves Jews, right, who are interested in cremation and kind of where those boundaries and borders are, and then pass it to Barry so we can talk about cremation and green.
Okay, so we handle cremation. We don't physically perform the cremation. We don't have a facility that does that, but when we're called, we move the deceased to our location and we communicate with the family about there's proper procedure, and then we facilitate the cremation and provide the cremated remains back to the family, or if they're choosing to bury them like a regular burial. So there's sort of a broad range of options with cremation. Some choose not to have a funeral service, and some do. Some choose to bury, and some choose to scatter in some form or take possession of and make a plan later or hold on to cremated remains. And, you know, we get lots of questions about cremation on a, you know, weekly basis, and it just something that is part of what comes up. Yeah.
And how do you help families that are interested in cremation find, if they're interested, someone to officiate?
Oh, certainly. So some, good question. So certainly some rabbis will not officiate when there's a cremation. Some will officiate as long as the cremated remains are not present. And then some will do, you know, with cremated remains present. And it just depends on the rabbi's personal protocols and possibly the protocols of the you know, movement that they follow.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Great. All right, Barry, take us home. What is green and not green about cremation?
Well, I have to say, before I get to cremation, I have to go back to organ donation for a second, really, because I'm never going to have another chance to tell the story. I had a good friend from Argentina who, when he first moved to the US, was driving with an Argentine license and got pulled over and got a ticket. And his name on the license was Donante Organo. And we laughed about that for quite a long time. On the issue of cremation and green, the Green Burial Council and the National Funeral Directors Association do not consider cremations to be green. Cremations themselves use a tremendous amount of energy, perhaps less energy over a long period of time than the energy associated with a concrete vault and a casket with, you know, exotic hardwoods and et cetera, and embalming. But the process itself is not considered green. That being said, within that continuum, there are green biodegradable urns. Cremains can be placed in biodegradable urns in many green cemeteries. There is that whole movement of being a tree, and there are a number of bio urns out there that mix the ashes with soil and nutrients and do grow a tree. So that's where that continuum comes in. There's a greenification, if you will, that can be applied to cremation, but the procedure itself is really not considered green.
Great, thank you. I wanted to add just two things that I learned, and there was a question that came in actually by email ahead about this new kind of movement, or this idea of people composting human remains, which is great. And I will share, if I can pull it up, there was a podcast that was talking about, so this is in Washington State. And then the idea of being buried like in a pod where you become the tree. I had asked at Honey Creek Woodlands when we were there, I asked the funeral director at Phoenix, who's that's the funeral home that is kind of right there out in Conyers. And I asked about that because I had heard about this idea that you could kind of be like put into the fetal position and kind of enmeshed in this pod, and then from there a tree would grow. And what she said to me was, we're not doing that here yet in Georgia because nobody's asked for it. So I think very interesting kind of new ideas. And I wanted to point out, if anybody had not seen it already, or if you have HBO, it was called Six New Ways to Die in America. So it was an HBO special. I'll send that out afterwards. I'll put that in the link or I'll put that into the email afterwards if people are interested in that. And it was fascinating. There was a small section, one of the 6 ways talked about green burial, and there was some video of green burial, which was very, very representative of the experience that we had, and it's a good way. But then there was also, the possibility of taking your cremains and putting them on a rocket ship and sending them out into space, and that didn't seem very green at all. But I think that people are, the idea of sort of choosing both how to die and how you will be handled, how your body will be handled or your remains will be handled in a much more personal way. People are innovating. We're always innovating, and there are a lot of new creative ways that people are thinking about death and dying. So we really only wanted, we knew we had time to take a slice, and because of this particular interest in green, and also kind of how some of these Jewish customs are being affected right now during this time. We thought that this was a great way to start the conversation. And I just want to thank my co-panelists, my co-conversationalists, Barry and Eddie, for joining in this conversation. And I want to thank everybody who joined us, both on Facebook Live and here in the Zoom room. And should I make that last request? I don't know if everybody is here. Usually we would just sort of end with a big thank you, and we would end the live stream and we would say, have a great night. But the question did come up earlier today, and I don't know if Arnie is here, but Barry, you are here and our mourner. There was a question about whether we would end with Mourner's Kaddish. So I don't know if y'all can wave or put in the chat. If there are people who are interested in reciting Kaddish, I would, before we sign off, anyone? We'd need at least a minion to stay on board. Barry, are you interested in saying Kaddish?
I would stay on board, but a lot of people are going to have to recite it too. My Hebrew is not good, and I'm on a cell phone right now. So
yes, I would be happy to lead the Kaddish, and people could join in. So if that's something, I'm just sort of looking for a wave. And I don't know, I'm just scrolling through. Is there, I see some people kind of going like this. If there is a need, I've got 1 thumbs up. So if I would, I'm going to ask Haley, I'm going to stop recording so I can share my screen, and I'll pull up the Kaddish. Okay, so we're going to go to gallery view, and I think, I guess we could keep doing Facebook Live. There might be somebody out there in Facebook land that would like to join us in Kaddish, but they won't be able to see the shared screen. So what I would suggest, and now can we go to gallery view? There we go. Ah, I can see all your faces. So I would suggest that you go ahead and stay muted. Let me pull up. Oh. Okay, I think it's here. Can give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Should I make it a little smaller? There we go. Okay, excellent. So it'll be a little cacophonous if everybody unmutes themselves, but anyone who would like to recite along with me, you can either recite along at home, you can unmute yourself and recite together. And then at some point, I would just ask that some of you, And here's where it becomes cacophonous, but at least we sort of feel like we're all together. And it would be nice, I think, also for Barry, if some of you would unmute yourselves when we get to the Yehei Shmei Rabbah line, so that you can respond and say Amen, and then and join in the Amens, so that at least there's some feedback and we can hear you saying Amen. All right, so thank you all for staying on so that those that need to recite Kaddish can. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash Shnei Rabbah v'yalmad divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'yamechon v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael v'agalav v'zman kariv v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehei Shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam olam hayah. Yibarach v'yishtabach v'yitbarar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh dar v'yitala v'yitala b'risha b'ela b'birchata v'shirata v'shbachata v'nechmata b'yalma
Amen.
Hey Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chaim Aleinu V'Yalkol Yisrael V'Yimru Amen. Seh Shalom B'Ramav Shalom Aleinu V'Yalkol Yisrael V'Yoshtei Tevel V'Yimru Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining us, and may you all be comforted among those who mourn. And we hope to see you again virtually, but also in person in happier times. And I was always told to say, next time at a simcha. So next time we'll talk about baby namings and weddings. But thank you all for joining in this conversation. And look for an email either tomorrow, or if I can't get it out before the holiday, then maybe on Sunday or Monday, we'll reach back to you and we'll share some of those links and some of those resources and the infographic that Barry designed, because he's definitely got the marketing and communications background. So we have this great infographic that will show you all of those connections between Jewish and green burial. And it has our contact information there as well. And so it's fair, right? I can speak for all three of us that we're happy to hear from you. If you have questions, please reach out to us. And I think that Haley also put our emails in the chat, but we'd love to hear from you. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks,
Bye,
Rabbi.
Latoya.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Barry.
Good night, everybody.
Barry.
Thank you.
Thank
Night,
you.
everyone.
Great.
Good night.